What if the Earth had already spoken before every great disaster? What if, long before the winds howled or the seas rose, nature had sent signals, visible, tangible, unmistakable, and yet humanity chose not to listen? What if the greatest tragedies of our recent history were not only storms of wind and water, but storms of neglect, denial, and forgetfulness? History suggests this is not a hypothetical question. The most destructive cyclones of the 21st century, Katrina in 2005, Haiyan in 2013, Haiyan in 2022, and Adalia in 2025, all carried with them warnings written directly into the environment. Clouds, tides, humidity, static, and silence all announced what was coming. Survivors recalled skies that looked wrong, seas that withdrew unnaturally, air that pressed down like a suffocating weight. Science, too, had already catalogued these signs. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in its 2021 report, dedicated entire sections to extreme event attribution, noting that not only are storms intensifying with climate change, but the precursors, the warnings of nature, are also becoming sharper and more visible. Yet, over and over, those signals went unheeded. Consider Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the storm that drowned New Orleans. In the days before landfall, meteorologists tracked a system that was intensifying rapidly in the warm waters of the Gulf. The IPCC's earlier assessments had already warned that rising sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic would create conditions for stronger cyclones. Residents, too, had their own signs. Oppressive humidity that clung to the skin, skies filled with towering anvil clouds, and tides rising higher than expected. Some fishermen noted confused waves offshore, waves breaking in directions that did not match the winds. Nature was speaking in multiple languages. Yet on the ground, evacuation orders came late, infrastructure was weak, and many residents dismissed the warnings. The levee system, designed for smaller storms, was left to bear the unimaginable force. When it failed, the disaster was not only meteorological, but human. More than 1,800 lives were lost, not because the storm was silent, but because the voices of nature and science were drowned out by inaction. Fast forward to 2013, in the Philippines. Typhoon Haiyan, known locally as Yolanda, struck with winds among the strongest ever recorded at landfall. Survivors tell of the night before. The air was thick, suffocating, Nangoptha as villagers described it. Radios crackled with interference, communication dropped, and in Tacloban the sea retreated dramatically before dawn, exposing seabeds in a way no one had ever seen. These were classic storm surge signals, recognized by scientists and written about in disaster manuals, but few in the villages had been taught what they meant. Some children played on the newly exposed beaches, fascinated by the retreating waters. Hours later, the surge returned with walls of water that swallowed entire neighborhoods. NASA's studies after Haiyan showed the ionosphere had been disturbed even before the cyclone reached peak strength, another electromagnetic footprint of disaster. And yet, while satellites captured these anomalies, the villagers below were left without translation. They felt the suffocating air, saw the fog, watched the sea, but the system had not taught them to act. More than 6,000 lives were lost in a catastrophe where nature had shouted its warnings. Hurricane Ian in 2022 brought similar lessons to Florida. By then, the IPCC had been clear. Warmer oceans, higher humidity, and shifting atmospheric dynamics were fueling storms that would intensify more quickly. And indeed, Ian grew explosively in the Gulf, from a manageable Category 2 to a devastating Category 4 in less than 24 hours. Residents in coastal areas recalled how, before landfall, the air felt strangely oppressive and the skies turned an eerie green at sunset. Tampa Bay once again experienced the unnatural retreat of its waters, exposing seabeds as Irma had done years earlier. Yet, despite the lessons of Irma, some residents still treated the phenomenon as spectacle. Social media filled with photos of people walking where water should have been. Hours later, the surge returned, flooding coastal communities and destroying lives. The science had been there, the signs had been clear, but the cultural habit of treating anomalies as curiosities rather than warnings persisted. Ian became a costly reminder that memory is short when warnings are uncomfortable. And then came Hurricane Adalia in 2025, another storm in a warming climate, another case where signals were overlooked. Early satellite data showed unusual lightning rings around the storm's core, concentric electrical bursts that JPL had identified in earlier research as precursors of rapid intensification. GPS signals degraded along the Florida coast, an electromagnetic signature that NASA's geospace scientists had already linked to cyclonic activity. On the ground, fishermen noted their radios had gone silent and their compasses behaved strangely. In the air, residents felt the suffocating humidity, described as like breathing soup. These were not coincidences, they were nature's warnings, confirmed by decades of research. And yet, evacuation compliance was low in some regions, partly because people had grown tired of false alarms, partly because the warnings of electromagnetic anomalies were never translated into public guidance. Adalia's surge and winds left devastation in its path, adding another chapter to the history of ignored signs. The IPCC's 2021 report makes clear that extreme events are now more frequent, more intense, and more dangerous. But it also highlights another truth. Communities that blend science with local observation fare better. Where villagers in Bangladesh are taught to flee when seas retreat, lives are saved. Where Florida meteorologists explain dew point and enthalpy flux in simple terms, telling people that when the air feels suffocating, the storm is feeding, residents take forecasts more seriously. Where Japan trains its communities to read both the sky and the radio, preparedness rises. In every case, the lesson is the same. Nature's warnings are not abstract, they are written in the air. The water, the sky, and the invisible fields above us. To survive, we must learn to translate them. The tragedy is that humanity often forgets. Memory of disaster fades. Communities rebuild, but lose the oral traditions that once kept people alert to natural signs. The IPCC warns that in an era of climate change, relying only on technology is not enough. Power grids fail, radios fall silent, forecasts don't reach everyone. But the environment still speaks, for those who remember how to listen. Part 1 of this reflection is about recognition. Katrina, Haiyan, Haiyan, Adalia. Different storms, different regions, but the same pattern. Warnings were visible, warnings were felt, warnings were measured, but warnings were not heeded. This is not only a story of meteorology, it is a story of cultural amnesia, where the oldest survival tool, listening to nature, has been overshadowed by dependence on fragile systems. The conclusion is as haunting as it is hopeful. The Earth does not strike in silence. It announces itself. In tides that retreat, in skies that glow, in air that suffocates, in radios that die. Our challenge is not to invent new senses, but to recover old ones, and to merge them with the science we already have. Because when the next storm comes, as it surely will, the question will not be whether nature warned us. It will be whether we chose to listen. Memory has always been one of humanity's most fragile defenses. We remember the pain of disasters, but as years pass, the clarity fades and the lessons dull. Communities rebuild, but warnings once carried in stories, traditions, and lived experience slip away. In the age of satellites and forecasts, people increasingly rely on official voices. Yet the environment itself continues to send signals, the same signals that guided ancestors through centuries of storms. When we forget to interpret them, we place ourselves at risk. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 remains one of the clearest examples. Scientists had been warning for years that the Gulf of Mexico's warm waters could fuel catastrophic storms. The IPCC's assessments in the early 2000s noted that climate change would likely make cyclones stronger and surges higher. Still, when Katrina gathered force, New Orleans was unprepared. Survivors later described days of unbearable humidity, air so heavy it seemed to stick in the lungs. Fishermen reported confused seas and odd tides. Residents spoke of skies that darkened with towering anvils stretching across the horizon. These were not poetic exaggerations. They were classic pre-storm signals. Yet many dismissed them as just Louisiana weather. When evacuation orders came, they were late and poorly coordinated. And when the levees failed, the catastrophe revealed not only engineering flaws, but also a cultural failure. A community that had forgotten how to listen to its own environment. The Philippines in 2013 faced a similar tragedy with Typhoon Haiyan. This storm struck with winds so strong that even hardened meteorologists were astonished. But long before landfall, the atmosphere was already screaming warnings. Villagers described how the air felt suffocating, Gopher. Fishermen noticed their radios cutting in and out, static replacing signals they relied on. In Tacloban, the sea retreated dramatically, exposing seabeds no one had ever walked on. These are textbook signals of surge, offshore winds pulling waters out before forcing them back in with devastating power. Yet many locals, unfamiliar with these meanings, treated the retreat as curiosity. Some even stepped onto the exposed flats to explore. Hours later, Haiyan's surge returned, destroying entire neighborhoods and taking thousands of lives. NASA and JPL analyses after the storm showed how the ionosphere above had already been disturbed, lightning rings forming around Haiyan's core, a signature of intensification. The science was clear. The natural clues were visible, but human systems failed to connect them. The IPCC's 2021 report on extreme events highlighted Haiyan as an emblem of climate-amplified disaster. It noted that storm surges of this scale are consistent with warmer seas and higher atmospheric moisture. It also pointed to the need for integrating traditional knowledge into preparedness. Communities had once relied on oral traditions warning against retreating seas, but over time, those lessons faded. Without cultural reinforcement, the signs were seen but not understood. The cost was counted in lives. Hurricane Ian in 2022 demonstrated how quickly storms can intensify in a warming world. In less than a day, Ian leapt from Category 2 to Category 4, feeding on Gulf waters that were unusually hot. Residents across Florida recall how the air turned sticky, oppressive, almost electric in its heaviness. Skies glowed with eerie greens at sunset. Tampa Bay emptied of water, exposing seabeds, a phenomenon that had occurred during Irma years before. Social media filled with photos of people walking where water should have been, treating the anomaly as spectacle rather than warning. Scientists at the time warned that the waters would return, but curiosity outpaced caution. Hours later, surge rolled back with violent force, inundating coastal towns. Ian became a $100 billion disaster, not only because of its winds, but also because lessons from Irma had not been absorbed. Nature had repeated its warning. Humanity had repeated its mistake. Then came Hurricane Adalia in 2025, a storm that once again reminded us of what ignoring signals costs. By now, research had already confirmed that storms produce electromagnetic anomalies, radio interference, GPS errors, magnetic fluctuations, before peak intensification. JPL had published findings on lightning rings as indicators of rapid strengthening. Yet when Adalia approached Florida, these signs were overlooked. Fishermen noted their radios silent. Pilots reported GPS errors. Compasses twitched inexplicably. Onshore, people felt suffocating humidity and saw fog rolling in at strange hours. All the signs were there, but evacuation compliance was low. Some mistrusted forecasts. Others grew weary of repeated warnings that hadn't materialized in past seasons. In effect, memory fatigue eroded preparedness. When Adalia's surge swept across coastal communities, the damage echoed Katrina and Haiyan, not because nature hid the storm, but because people ignored the translation. The IPCC section on extreme events stresses that attribution is more than measuring causes. It's about understanding consequences. Climate change is raising baselines. Seas are higher, storms are wetter, rapid intensification is more likely. But it also emphasizes the importance of risk perception. Communities that treat unusual environmental signals as reliable are better prepared. Those that dismiss them as anomalies suffer worse. Katrina, Haiyan, Ian, Adalia, all are case studies in ignored signals. Eyewitness memories make these lessons visceral. A New Orleans resident recalled standing on her porch before Katrina, feeling air so heavy it was like breathing through a wet cloth. She thought it was just Louisiana heat. A farmer in Leyte before Haiyan remembered fog rolling across fields hours before landfall, but assumed it was morning mist. A teenager in Tampa during Ian filmed himself walking on the seabed of Tampa Bay, laughing at the emptiness, unaware he was walking on a death trap. A fisherman in Florida before Adalia cursed his radio for failing, then went to sea anyway. Each of these moments was a warning ignored. Each became part of the chain of loss. The consistency of these testimonies is haunting. People felt the suffocation, saw the fog, watched the seas retreat, noticed the silence in radios. They experienced every classic signal, but without the cultural or educational reinforcement to interpret them, the clues became trivia instead of alarms. This disconnect between observation and action is perhaps the greatest challenge of disaster preparedness today. What these cases reveal is not only scientific truth, but cultural memory at risk. For centuries, communities survived storms by combining observation with oral teaching. Elders told children, if the sea retreats, run inland. If the air suffocates, seek shelter. If the radio crackles and dies, beware. But as modernization replaced oral traditions with reliance on formal forecasts, the habit of interpreting natural signals weakened. And when forecasts fail, communities find themselves blind, even though the environment is still shouting. The storms of the 21st century, amplified by climate change, prove that we cannot afford such amnesia. Katrina, Haiyan, Haiyan, Adalia, different coasts, different cultures, the same pattern. Nature warned, humanity ignored. The lesson is urgent. Science and tradition must merge. The IPCC calls for multi-knowledge frameworks. In adaptation, blending indigenous and local knowledge with modern research. In practice, this means teaching communities not only to trust satellites, but also to trust their senses. It means treating humidity, tides, fog, static, and silence not as curiosities, but as cues. Because in the end, disasters are not surprises. They are failures of interpretation. The Earth sends its signals every time. The challenge is whether we choose to remember. Every disaster leaves two stories. One is the story of destruction, the winds, the waters, the buildings torn apart. The other is the story of warnings missed, of signals dismissed, of a dialogue between nature and humanity that was left unfinished. When we examine the history of Katrina, Haiyan, Haiyan, and Adalia, the pattern is not only meteorological, it is cultural, psychological, and deeply human. From New Orleans in 2005 to Tacloban in 2013, from Tampa in 2022 to Florida again in 2025, the same theme emerges. Nature sent its clues, but people chose to ignore them. Survivors describe air so heavy it seemed unbreathable, seas retreating like a vanishing tide, skies glowing with unnatural colors, radios falling silent. Scientists measured humidity spikes, ionospheric disturbances, and lightning rings. Both forms of evidence pointed to the same truth. The storm was imminent. And yet, in moment after moment, action was delayed. Evacuation orders went unheeded. Warnings were doubted. Signals were reinterpreted as curiosities or coincidences. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in its 2021 report on extreme events, highlighted this exact problem. The science of attribution confirms that storms are intensifying because of warming oceans, higher humidity, and rising seas. But the panel also emphasized a different kind of vulnerability, the erosion of cultural memory. Communities that once passed down survival wisdom, oral traditions about tides, skies, and air, are now forgetting those lessons, relying instead on fragile systems of communication. When those systems fail, the gap becomes deadly. Global comparisons reveal the stakes. In Bangladesh, villagers are taught that when the sea retreats, they must run inland immediately. This knowledge, reinforced through generations of loss, has saved lives during cyclones. In Japan, schools include disaster education, teaching children to recognize unusual skies, humidity shifts, and early surges. In contrast, in parts of the Philippines before Haiyan and in Florida before Haiyan and Adalia, such teachings were not widely shared. The result was the same. People saw anomalies but did not understand them. Where memory was preserved, survival increased. Where memory was lost, tragedy deepened. Science reinforces the importance of these signals. NASA's geospace research shows that storms disturb the ionosphere long before landfall, disrupting radio and GPS. JPL confirms that lightning rings mark intensification phases. The NHC explains how rising dew points create the suffocating humidity people feel on shore. NOAA tide gauges record water retreating before surges return. These are not vague impressions. They are quantifiable, measurable, replicable phenomena. Nature is consistent. It warns in multiple languages: visible, physical, electromagnetic. The only inconsistency lies in how humans respond. The psychological component cannot be underestimated. In disaster research, normalcy bias describes the human tendency to downplay threats, to interpret anomalies as temporary or harmless. It explains why people stood on Tampa's exposed seabed before Haiyan, why children played on Tacloban's retreating shores before Haiyan, why New Orleans residents brushed off oppressive air before Katrina. The signs were felt and seen, but the brain reinterpreted them as spectacle or inconvenience. Normalcy bias turned warnings into background noise. Combating this bias requires not only forecasts but cultural reinforcement, stories, teachings, and reminders that break through denial. The cost of ignoring these lessons is rising in an age of climate change. The IPCC warns that storms are not only stronger but also intensifying more rapidly. Rapid intensification, where a storm leaps 2 categories in less than a day, leaves little time for response. In such cases, natural signals, humidity, tide shifts, static, may provide the only real-time cues communities can sense without instruments. Failing to teach people to recognize them wastes one of the few tools still available when official systems are overwhelmed. Survivors, memories provide sobering clarity. A woman in New Orleans recalled that before Katrina, the air felt wrong, but we just thought it was August heat. A farmer in Leyte before Haiyan said, the fog came when it shouldn't have, but we had fields to tend. A teenager in Florida before Ian posted a video of himself walking on dry seabeds, joking, this is crazy, unaware he was standing in the path of a surge. A fisherman before Adalia in 2025 cursed his silent radio and still sailed. Each of these moments shows the disconnect, perception without translation. The senses worked, the lessons did not. The challenge ahead is not inventing new technology, but rebuilding cultural memory. Science alone cannot save communities if the people do not act on its findings. Tradition alone cannot protect lives if oral knowledge fades without reinforcement. But together, science and tradition, satellite and story, they form the strongest shield we have. A villager who feels suffocating air and knows it means storm feeding can prepare. A fisherman who hears static and knows it signals atmospheric disturbance can return to port. A child who learns that seas retreat before they rise will run inland instead of playing. This integration of knowledge is not optional, it is survival. History's reflection offers one more truth. Disasters are only disasters when warnings are ignored. Katrina's levees, Haiyan's surge, Ian's retreating seas, Adalia's silent radios, each was preceded by signals that could have saved more lives. The IPCC's findings are clear. As climate change accelerates, the signals will only grow louder. Warmer air will feel more suffocating. Seas will retreat farther before rushing back. Lightning rings will flash brighter around intensifying storms. The question is whether humanity will continue to treat these as curiosities, or whether we will finally interpret them as alarms. The conclusion is unavoidable. The Earth never strikes without warning. It always leaves fingerprints in air, water, sky, and spectrum. We are the ones who forget, deny, or look away. But the lessons of Katrina, Haiyan, Ian, and Adalia demand that we remember. To ignore nature's voice is to choose vulnerability. To listen is to choose survival. At Crisis Lens, we believe that awareness is the first defense. We bring together science, history, and memory to show how nature speaks before every storm. The past is not only tragedy, it is also a teacher. By learning from ignored signals, we can prepare for the next great storm, not with fear, but with knowledge. Subscribe to Crisis Lens for more stories of disaster and resilience, for the hidden sciences of survival, and for the reminders that nature has always warned us, we only need to listen. Share this video with those who live in storm-prone regions, because when the skies grow strange, when the air grows heavy, when the seas retreat, and when radios fall silent, the storm has already spoken. The question is, will we respond?